Good afternoon and welcome to Ocean Expert Exchange. Scientists in every Florida school and ANGARI Foundation are proud to be partnering again this fall to continue to bring this series to you. In this series, we dive into all things marine science and technology to share what's happening in the field. And today we'll be talking with Dr. Elizabeth Whitman about sea turtle ecology. And before we introduce her shortly, we're going to just briefly tell you a little bit more about our programs. Scientists in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The CEFS program connects and builds long-term partnerships between teachers and scientists in order to bring current scientific research and big data into classrooms in Florida and beyond. ANGARI Foundation is a nonprofit headquartered in West Palm Beach, Florida. The foundation supports and promotes marine science research and education, and many of the foundation's primary initiatives involve its 65-foot research vessel, the RV ANGARI. In case you missed any of the information in today's preview slides, we'd like to remind you that you can leave questions for the scientists by typing them in the chat box today, and we'll also be providing a survey at the end of today's presentation for a chance at some really cool swag, so we hope you'll take part. At this time, we'd like to introduce you to Dr. Elizabeth Whitman from Florida International University. Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am a visiting assistant teaching professor at Florida International University, and let me share my screen to tell you more about my work. Okay, so predicting how animals will respond to changes in their environments is critical for managing both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And large grazers, or the herbivores, the plant eaters, are one group that are particularly important to study because of their position in the food web, their potential to impact the structure of the ecosystem, and their history of exploitation by humans. I am especially interested in the habitat use of green turtles in seagrass ecosystems because seagrasses are valuable ecosystems. They offer services such as the base of many food webs. They offer complex habitat for a variety of organisms. They're one of the largest atmospheric carbon sinks, and they help to stabilize sediment. They are also some of the most imperiled ecosystems by climate change, dredging, pollution, and in some cases, overgrazing. So today I will be taking you to the Caribbean, off a couple Caribbean islands, to really look at the factors that affect green turtle foraging decisions, including food availability, like this seagrass, predation risk from large sharks, and then we'll talk about some disturbances, including an invasive seagrass and increasingly severe hurricanes. Let's start in Abaco in the Bahamas, where I set out to investigate the effects of predation pressure and food availability on green turtle distributions, and also habitat selection. And this is all within a shark and turtle sanctuary marked by the dotted line, where sea turtles have been protected since 2009 and sharks have been protected since 2011. We'll focus on one of my sites. This is called the Bight of Old Robinson. It's about 9 square kilometers, the bay itself, with 3 square kilometers of tidal creeks surrounding it. To aid in my analysis, I divided the study site into grid cells, and I assigned each one of them a habitat type, including tidal creeks, nearshore habitat that's outside of the tidal creeks and adjacent to land, and open water habitat that is not adjacent to land and offers very little shelter. My first goal was to characterize the food availability to sea turtles in the Bight of Old Robinson. So to do this, I recruited a team of mermaids for science to assist me in conducting seagrass abundance surveys. Green turtles, especially in the Bahamas, are also known to target seagrasses that are high in nutrient content. So we also collected samples of seagrass to analyze for nutrient content back at the lab. And what I found in terms of seagrass abundance is that open water habitat had the greatest abundance of seagrass. And here I'm showing you in tidal creeks, nearshore, and open water habitat. The open water and nearshore habitat had the highest abundance of turtle grass, or Thalassia testudinum. So in each of these figures, I'll show you creek, nearshore, and open, and how that plays out in the bay. So this is food availability, highest in the open and nearshore. So if food abundance alone was to dictate turtle distributions, we would expect something like this, with most turtle observations in the open water and nearshore habitats. Nutrient content analysis revealed something different. Both nitrogen and phosphorus content in Thalassia were significantly higher in the tidal creeks than in the other two habitats. So if food nutrient content alone was to dictate turtle distributions, we would predict that based on nitrogen content or phosphorus content, we would find the most turtles in the tidal creeks, with a few accessing the patches of seagrass with high nutrients in the other habitats, but mostly in the tidal creeks. To take a look at predation risk, I collected data on shark distributions using baited remote underwater video. And these videos were collected with a high definition video camera pointed at a bait bag downstream of the camera to see what came by to check it out. This was part of a larger project, the Global Fin Print Project. I sampled 4 fringing reefs off Abaco like this one, and 2 seagrass bays, including the Bight of Old Robinson, like in this picture. Within the Bight of Old Robinson specifically, the tiger shark sightings were concentrated in the open water habitat. And we're focused on tiger sharks here because they pose the greatest risk to sea turtles in this area, with one observed in deeper water habitat in the nearshore habitat. And based on predation risk alone, we would expect to find turtles in the refuge of the tidal creeks or nearshore areas where they would have easy access to the tidal creeks. Okay, now that we've characterized the landscape in terms of food quantity, food nutrient content, and predation risk, we now need to compare the predictions to how turtles are actually distributed. So to figure that out, I used a DJI quadcopter drone to survey the turtles. I'll point a few turtles out to you. These surveys are really ideal because they're low cost. We can sample areas we can't get to with a boat, and they're highly efficient. We can run them relatively quickly. And I found that turtle sighting density was significantly greater in the creek and the nearshore habitats than the open water habitats. In the open water habitats, we had near 0 sightings. The large standard deviation here that we observed is because of the turtles being concentrated in a few areas. So how do these turtle sightings line up with our predictions from before? Well, turtle distributions appear to be nearly opposite to the trends observed in food quantity among habitats, with the greatest number of turtles occurring in habitats with low food abundance. So that's weird. What's going on? Well, turtle distributions line up a lot better with seagrass nutrient content, with the highest levels of both nitrogen and phosphorus in the tidal creeks where we saw the most turtles. And there weren't enough tiger shark sightings to include them in our statistical analysis, but when we look at where we saw tiger sharks, it's not unreasonable to think that the turtles are also avoiding the open water habitat because of the risk of running into a predator. So what's next? Well, in 2019, Hurricane Dorian hit Abaco as the strongest hurricane to ever make landfall. And in collaboration with the Bahamas Marine Mammal Research Organization and Dr. Stephanie Archer and Betsy Stoner, we are monitoring and hoping to find out. So this map I am showing you is 4 sites where we had data before the hurricane and where we're collecting data after the hurricane. And the black line is the path of Hurricane Dorian. And what we found that pre-Hurricane Dorian, turtle grass densities were much higher than after Hurricane Dorian, especially at our northern sites. And what was really key here is that it affected our sites differently. So some of our sites, our southern sites, did not seem to lose so much seagrass when compared to our northern sites. So a lot more monitoring to do, and then hopefully in collaboration with Earthwatch and Annabelle Brooks, we will get back to assess the sea turtle populations this coming summer. But in summary, what do we know so far? Seagrass nutrient content and predation pressure drive green turtle distributions, and Hurricane Dorian has disproportionate impacts on the abundance of seagrasses across our different sites. So in the Bahamas, we saw the effects of food nutrient content and predation pressure on turtle habitat use. But we have to move further south to investigate the effects of an invasive seagrass on green turtles. So for this study, we're going to focus today on Guadeloupe in the French West Indies. And the invasive seagrass here, Halophilus stipulaceae, is non-native, fast-growing, and can tolerate a wide range of temperature, salinity, depth, and disturbance regimes. It's proving to be a very successful invasive in the Caribbean, in part because it can settle in both sandy bottom and established native seagrass beds. Both this invasive and the native I'm showing you here are pioneer species, meaning that they have a rapid turnover, they can grow quickly, but this invasive can grow horizontally twice as fast as this native species Syringodium. And from this image, I really want you to look at the differences in habitat structure created by the native here and the invasive here, and start to imagine how this could impact the animal communities that live within them. But for my study, just like in the Bahamas, we defined the landscape in terms of food abundance and food nutrient content. And we quantified turtle distributions using a slightly different method. We swam these belt transects where 2 observers are bound together with a 15-meter line and a safety buoy in the middle. And we counted all turtles that fell within that belt. We could not fly the drone there for several reasons, so we did a lot of swimming off Guadeloupe. And what we found is that green turtles avoid the shallow areas, maybe because there are a lot of swimmers in the water there, and they're most likely to be found in areas of high seagrass abundance, regardless of the species. One interesting note about this site, though, is that native and invasive seagrasses had similar nutrient content. So here I'm showing you % nitrogen content from the invasive. From here on out, the invasive will be in orange and all native will be some shade of green. And there was no significant difference in nutrient content among these species. So the turtles hang out where there's a lot of seagrass, but when they're there, what are they choosing to eat? Well, this matters because depending on their choices, they could either be slowing down or speeding up the spread of the invasive species. So we followed turtles around with high definition video cameras on long poles for about 30 minutes each. And from these videos, we estimate the availability of each seagrass species to the turtle, and we counted the number of bites of each species taken by that turtle. And to look at individual resource selection, here I am showing you each bar represents what one turtle is eating. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the proportion of bites. Remember again that orange is invasive and green is native. And really what I want you to see here is that across all of these turtles, there's a lot of green. So they're eating a lot of the native seagrass. But there are also some bars that are pretty orange. So there are some individuals who are eating that native seagrass. And the overall trend that we observed was that regardless of the relative abundance of native and invasive seagrass, green turtles selectively fed on the native seagrass species. And this held true unless the seagrass available to the turtles was nearly exclusively invasive. And these findings are really critical to our understanding of how large herbivores might impact a plant invasion. And of course, shortly after collecting our data on foraging, our site here was also hit by a hurricane. Hurricane Maria hit Guadalupe in the fall of 2017. So here we also have data before the storm and after the storm. So let's take a look at some of the seagrass data. It changed the seagrass beds. So what I'm showing you here in this top row is data on the native seagrass, Syringodium. And on the bottom row, I'm showing you data on the invasive seagrass. First, in the spring of 2017, this is before the hurricane hit, there was quite a bit of invasive, but there was also quite a bit of native. The larger the point, the more seagrass at that survey point. About a month after that hurricane hit in the fall of 2017, seagrass really was pretty much wiped out of the bay. You can see here, even a month later, there is some invasive coming back, but there's very, very little native. And about 9 months later, in the spring of 2018, there's almost no native seagrass at our survey points and a lot of invasive species. So this really changed what was available to the turtles to eat. And the relative abundance were also reflected in the foraging decisions of the green turtles. So before this dotted line is before Hurricane Maria, after the dotted line, after the hurricane. And here I'm showing you the proportion of foraging turtles selecting each resource. Again, before there's a lot more green than orange, so more individuals are eating the native. After the hurricane, a lot more individuals are eating that invasive. But what's really interesting here is that spring of 2018, we see a lot more diversity in their diet. I put a picture here of a ctenophore because we noticed the turtles going after gelatinous prey, and we just lumped them all into ctenophores than we ever had before. So some unanswered questions here about, are they just looking for a new food source, or will they start to eat this invasive exclusively? All right, so in summary of the Guadalupe data, the seagrass abundances are driving distributions. The turtles go where the seagrass is. They tend to select native seagrasses over invasive seagrasses when it's available. And Hurricane Maria might cause a diet shift to more invasive seagrasses. So I hope you enjoyed our tour through the Caribbean. And with that, I'd like to thank ANGARI and everybody helping to put this talk together and the funding sources. My major contributors, Michael Heithaus and Jeremy Kiska, are collaborators. And with that, I will take any questions.
Dr. Whitman, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. We're going to begin our Q&A portion of today's Ocean Expert Exchange. If anybody has any questions that's tuning in, whether you're on Zoom or YouTube, feel free to write in the chat and I can ask that question for you. So let's jump right in. Our first question comes from Tina, and she asks, how did the invasive species get established in French West Indies?
Great question. So this invasive species actually came from the Red Sea, and it came into the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal, and then we believe it came over on pleasure yachts in Bilgewater to the Caribbean. It was first noticed in Grenada in 2002, or first documented then, and since then it has spread very quickly, and it's as far north as Puerto Rico now. So it can transplant just by fragments. So if you rip it up, it can float away and establish itself that way. So it spreads very quickly.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Kennedy, who asks, how soon after a hurricane Do you have to be on site to document the impacts that you described earlier?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one because the answer is the sooner the better. But these hurricanes, of course, don't just impact the seagrasses and the marine life. They seriously impact the infrastructure on these islands. So it takes a lot to build back the islands to the point where we can even get there to do this work. So the best answer is the sooner the better before things start to regrow.
Next, Elizabeth is curious, what about the hurricanes makes the invasive grass more prolific?
That's a good question too. And my best educated guess is that it doesn't have to compete for space anymore. Once the hurricane has wiped out all of the seagrass, it can just take over. It doesn't have to compete for space or nutrients, any resources that the native seagrasses would be using.
Thank you. Karen asks, will you continue this line of research or be starting something new in the short-term future?
Yeah, so we're really hoping to get back to Abaco and look more into the effects of the hurricane on the seagrasses and what it means when a seagrass bed looks a certain way before the hurricane to what it looks like afterwards. So we do have some plans to get back there, and I do hope to continue this research. Also hoping to expand it to other species, other grazing species like manatees. There are manatees in Puerto Rico, so that's another grazer that will be encountering or is encountering this invasive species.
Sure. Anne asks, when you were doing your drone shots earlier, was it all one specific species of sea turtle that you were looking at?
That's a great question. There is a chance that we captured other species, but we also do turtle captures in that area as part of a tagging program, a mark recapture program. And it's very rare that we capture another species. So my assumption is that they are primarily green turtles in those areas.
Abigail asks, have you noticed any relationship between halophilia, invasion success, and nutrient pollution?
That is not something that I have looked into. There are some papers that have been coming out looking at that. Everywhere that I've studied, it's been similar nutrient loading in the bays. So I have not studied that specifically, but I'd be happy to send resources if you want to get in touch with me.
No problem, thank you. Patricia asks, has any research been conducted to determine the impact, if any, on the population of green sea turtles?
The impact of the hurricane or of the hurricanes? Yeah, so we are hoping to get back again to the Bahamas to see how they have been impacted. During a hurricane, they're highly mobile, so they can go to deep water and kind of hide from it. We did have reports of some turtles that were lifted up onto land because of Hurricane Dorian on Abaco. But how they have been affected by changes to their environment, we have yet to assess. So hoping to get back there this summer.
Suzanne writes in saying that she's a CTE instructor who often uses spreadsheets to teach her students about Excel and working with data. And she thinks the idea of a project to track turtles and their diet would be a lot of fun. So she's curious if you or your lab shares the data that you have.
Yeah, so anything that we publish, our data is publicly available. So I'm happy to share that with you. So the data on the invasive seagrass and the camera follows that we did is already published and available. Yes.
Anne-Marie says, hurricanes will always be here. Why not use them to your advantage? Is there a way to propagate the native grasses by maybe seed pods or seedlings and use the power of the hurricanes as a transporter? Or your study is not about grasses, but more about the turtles?
Yeah, so I'm a sea turtle ecologist. And when I talk about ecology, that means what eats what and what other factors affects the sea turtles. So it's primarily studying the turtles, but that means I study what they eat and what eats them. But It's an interesting question. Seagrass restoration is a difficult business to be in for a few reasons. The resources that it takes to restore a small plot of land are enormous for some species. It's been successful in other areas like the Chesapeake Bay, but that's a different species of seagrass. So it's a tough business to be in, and people are trying to figure out better ways to do it.
Thank you. Greg is curious, if the hurricane removes native seagrass, is the invasive seagrass just as likely to be uprooted, or does it have a root system capable of withstanding hurricanes?
Great question. So what I showed you was a month after the hurricane. So what I think we saw there was that invasive already coming back. So it's actually a really shallow rooted seagrass. It can be ripped up really easily, but it spreads through fragments. So a hurricane comes through, rips it up, and produces all these fragments that can then go establish new beds all by themselves. So hurricanes actually do help spread the invasive seagrass.
Thank you. Alejandro writes in, has this field of study always appealed to you, or how did you get involved? How did you get interested?
I laugh because I took a long, windy road to get to where I am. So anybody out there who's unsure of what they want to do, that's okay. Yeah, I did my undergrad in communications. I did my master's degree in environmental sciences studying hydrodynamics over oyster reefs, went on a vacation, hung out with some sea turtles. I was like, hey, they're cool. Let me look into studying them. And that's what I did my PhD on. So that's the short version of the long, windy trail to get here. But I think they're a fascinating creature because of where they sit in the food web and how they can affect ecosystem structure.
Eric asks, if there is no significant nutritional difference between the seagrasses, do you predict that sea turtle would be affected if they do switch their diet to invasive grasses?
Yeah, so in this site, probably not. In other places, they have seen significant differences in nutrient content. So it's interesting that this doesn't hold true across all sites. What I am guessing is happening at this site is the sea turtles simply are not recognizing it yet as a food source. Until there's nothing else to eat, then they say, okay, hey, I'll try this because it's the only thing there. But I think it's just a matter of them not recognizing it just yet.
Jenny's wondering if green turtles are also over harvested or if they're part of illegal trades at all.
Yeah, so sea turtle conservation is another tough issue because where they hatch isn't where they feed, isn't where they mate. So it's an international issue. So some places harvesting is legal to different degrees. Some places it's completely banned. And you see those effects downstream, right? So if the eggs are being harvested on a beach, then you'll see those effects in the foraging areas. If they're being harvested in the foraging areas, you'll see that on the nesting beaches. So yes, they are still endangered. There are more conservation efforts needed. For example, in the Bahamas, they are not sexually mature. They cannot reproduce until they're in their mid-30s. So they have to hang out there for decades before they're able to reproduce and contribute to the population.
Richard is wondering, at what depth can you see the sea turtles while you're using a drone? And he's also curious if you're able to spot sharks along the way.
Yeah, we've seen sharks with the drone, so that's fun. We've only seen little ones that the turtles are not afraid of at all. But at the sites where I used the drone, the deepest it got was about 15 feet. So about 5 meters was the max depth we went to. And it's crystal clear water there. So we are just writing up a paper right now, testing out the environmental impacts on our ability to detect subsurface green turtles. So good question.
We're going to start to wrap up with another 2 to 3 questions or so. And our next one comes from Jen, who's wondering if you've seen any increase or decrease in predator behavior on turtles before and or after storms.
I haven't Since we haven't assessed after Hurricane Dorian, no, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It may or may not be. We just haven't had a chance to get there and study it yet, especially with COVID-19. We have to take great precaution, and we don't want to travel internationally during the pandemic. So that's to be seen. Good question, though.
And Danielle is curious, does the turtle grazing of invasive seagrass help to maintain the health of the bed? And in the way that it is said to do with turtle grass? Like, do you think that there is a possibility for excess grazing of the invasive seagrass to the detriment of the population, of the seagrass population?
That was one of our hypotheses going into that, is if they eat this invasive species, could they slow down the spread, right? But since they're not targeting it yet, or that we've really documented, except for a few seasons after Hurricane Maria, we don't know how much they will be able to affect this invasive species in terms of its spread or just maintenance in one area. It's to be seen.
Well, Dr. Whitman, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today. And again, you taking your time and sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it. I know I've certainly learned a lot. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. We have a lot of scientists out there, I can tell, because excellent research questions.
Thank you again. At this point, Stephanie is going to start wrapping up our presentation for today with some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Brian. We want to thank everyone for joining us today on the call to explore sea turtles with Dr. Whitman. Especially a big thank you for Dr. Whitman joining us and telling us these great stories about native and invasive seagrasses along the way. K-12 extension resources related to today's topic can be found along with today's recording on the UF Earth Systems YouTube channel, and they can also be found in the chat box. I believe our team is working on getting that there for you now. You can also find out additional information about ANGARI Foundation and the scientists in every Florida school by visiting the websites and the social media that you see here on your screen. And we hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. We've added the survey as promised for swag in the chat box. We encourage you to participate in that survey, and we hope to see you next Ocean Expert Exchange on mangroves, which will be on December 3rd. Until then, we hope you have a safe and happy Thanksgiving holiday. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.